All right, great. Let's start. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the third episode of our drought learning series. This is an initiative by the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center and the German Red Cross, together with all the people that are presenting in this series. So we call this series Want to Talk About Drought. So it's an 8-part series on anticipatory action for drought within the Red Cross and Red Crescent. But of course, we welcome everybody to join the discussion with us, I hope you're all able to see my screen. I will walk you a bit through Menti, where we will also do some exercises, but that's why to not keep always changing. That's why everything is in Menti. So what is on today, and also more in general. So we started off in like basically 1 month ago with a session on the big picture session. Okay, what is drought as a, what is drought when we talk about drought as a humanitarian issue, and what is the role of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in this? And so what we try to do in this very first session is to conceptualize drought a bit better, understanding what does it actually mean when we are talking about anticipatory action for drought. And then 2 weeks ago, we started with our technical sessions. So here in the first session of understanding drought risk, of which we have the second today, we tried to understand drought as a hazard and its impact. So in that session, we tried to disentangle it a little bit. When we're talking about drought, what is it actually that we're talking about? What is the hazard, but what are also the impacts, and how do these two relate also when we look at it in a more at different time scales? So that was 2 weeks ago. And today we are looking basically at the second session about understanding drought risk. And here we are looking into the underlying drought risk factors. So here today we want to understand, so what drives our drought risk? So what are the, who and what is exposed to drought and why? So we want to talk about vulnerability indicators and vulnerability factors. We want to talk about coping capacities of the people we are trying to serve. And then, as you can see in the timeline, we will follow with 2 sessions on forecasting drought. So here we're talking more about forecasting tools, but also on how to develop triggers for drought anticipatory action. And then the last 2 technical sessions will focus on acting early, so selecting early actions. The first one will focus on the theory of change for drought early actions, whereas the second one will focus specifically on cash-based early actions for drought, as we see a lot of cash-based early actions in our early action protocol. Whereas then in the last session, which will again be a bit of a frame session, will be a big picture session again. So here we will look into compound risk and climate change. So we want to, after all these technical sessions, we want to zoom out again and look at, okay, what happens if drought compounds with another hazard, or what happens in situations like currently in Somalia, where we have several drought seasons, one after another. So this is what we want to look into in the last session. So as you can see in the timeline, we will have those sessions bi-weekly. So you can already register for all the remaining sessions, 3 to 8. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me, Karen Dahl from the German Red Cross, or Gigma and Dorothy from the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center. To move on, before we start, a bit of housekeeping. So as you've seen in your invite, you have an invite for approximately for 1.5 hours. So the first hour always we want to use to present 1 or 2 of our case studies. So here we want to zoom into one specific case, look into how did they, in their specific context, conceptualize it, how did they address the problems and the challenges. And then we have time for a more informal chat for approximately half an hour after this 1 hour of inputs and Q&A. You're of course invited to use the Zoom chat liberally, but also, as in the last sessions, you can use the Slido. I will put a I will put the link to Slido and also the Menti and everything and the collaborative documents here in the chat. So in Slido, how it works, you will see if you click on the link, you can put questions, but if you like a question, one question particularly from another person, you can put a thumbs up on that question, and that will automatically then rank the questions so that we know which of the questions are most pertinent or most interesting for you. So please use Slido for your questions. Also, we have a collaborative notes document where big thanks to Climate Center team of interns that will also help to populate this. And as you can see, when you click on the collaborative notes, it follows the structure of an early action protocol. So we really try to capture all the different aspects and steps of an early action protocol that are mentioned here and try to bring that back into one big early action protocol, basically. We have translation. So for those of you who would rather like to listen in French, please click on the small globe at the bottom. Si vous avez besoin de français, vous pouvez cliquer sur le petit globe sur le Zoom. Il y aura aussi l'interprétation. So you can listen in both French and English, and of course also pose your questions in French if necessary. Okay, then let me see how we go on. All right, so can I invite you all to click on the Menti that I already put in the chat. So there's a link in the chat to the Menti. I can also post my whole post again. No, I think it's still up there. So we want to warm up a little bit with everybody on when you think about your drought context in which you work or in which you also live, who and what is mainly exposed to drought in your context? Try to be as specific as possible. Does the Menti work for everybody? I'm waiting a little bit more. Okay, now the things are coming. Okay, so now we see, okay, now it's happening. So who and what is exposed to drought in your context? So we see livestock a lot. Okay, cattle loss, that's related. Crops, agriculture, what do we have? Crop losses. We see women, farmers, pastoralists. We have water sources, people in general. We have an area defined sub-Saharan Africa. We have smallholder farmers. Okay, so we see lots of agriculture being exposed to drought, apart from also then on top some particularly vulnerable groups such as IDPs. What else? Is there anything new? I think we see lots of livestock here in the middle. Potable water insecurity. So water as in drinking water. We see older people. Okay. We see, okay, so, and others. Okay, thank you. So we have an overview a little bit. We see lots of agriculture, be it crops, be it livestock, and some of the most vulnerable groups, such as the IDPs. Let's move on to the next question. When we are talking about drought risk, of course, we are not talking only about exposure, but we are also talking about drought vulnerability. So thinking about now those exposed people and also elements that you've just identified, what are the main drought vulnerability factors in your context? So what does contribute to the vulnerability to drought in your specific context, be it again that you live there or that you that you work in that specific area. So what does contribute to the overarching risk in terms of vulnerability when we're talking about drought? Okay, so we see one big factor is poverty, as such, then access to sanitation. The dependency on rainwater. So here we again see like the link to the meteorological drought. So if there's meteorological drought, then of course we also see less rainwater, and then we see a dependency on that is a problem. Then we have unfavorable topography, which I'm not 100% I understand. So if that person would like to, can also unmute and explain that point. If that is of interest. If not, we can also leave it aside. We see wash needs, we see migration as one big vulnerability factor. We see temperature fluctuations. We see concrete action plans that are contributing to vulnerability. One factor of vulnerability. We see access to sanitation. We had wash needs and access to water more in general. And then rain-fed agriculture. So again, this dependency on the rainfall for agriculture, low-income poverty maybe going together, rural communities. Yes, of course, I think when we talk about drought, we a lot of times talk about drought in rural settings. We see low response finance, so there's not enough financing for response as well. We don't have social protection systems in place. There's a lack of savings in some communities. Okay, so we see already with the vulnerability, it becomes quite clear that there's lots of diverse factors that go into what makes people vulnerable to drought. So thanks a lot. Yeah, again, one of the economic vulnerability factors, limited alternative income, yes, generally climate change, conflict access. Okay, so we see there's a lot of different factors for drought vulnerability. We see one of the biggest chunks in this word cloud. I mean, the bigger the writing, the more often this was voted. So we see poverty and rain-fed agriculture as two big factors when we talk about vulnerability to drought. Okay, let's move on to the last. Before we zoom into our case study, let's talk about also what helps people to cope with drought. So thinking about, again, your context, what are the coping capacities of people to cope with drought? So looking also on the positive side, what can people use to cope with drought? What are their capacities? And again, thinking about your own context, or your working context, your living context. Okay, now it's floating. So we see there is, in terms of coping capacities, we can use forecasts. Oh yes, that's something we can do if they are available. There is insurance that goes a bit in the same directions. We can use cash-based transfers. If possible, some communities might have alternative income sources. There's water conservation possibilities. We see like self-help groups, and I saw it, where did I see it now? Yeah, micro insurances, and again, it comes with insurance. There is the possibility, of course, to drip irrigation, so not to be dependent so much on the rain-fed irrigation. Maybe we have drought-resistant crops, of course. What else do we have? Traditional irrigation, so another type of irrigation. We can, we like in terms of coping, we can, some people have access to purified water supply. So even though, there might not be otherwise sufficient water, clean water supply, there are possibilities to access purified water, other financial supports, humanitarian aid in general. Okay, so we see there are also some possibilities to cope with drought already. On that, of course, we can also build. Great, thank you very much. Let's move to the next slide, basically. So I would like to welcome Naomi Nyanya. She's the data lead at Kenya Red Cross. And today she will walk us through how they explored underlying drought risk factors, so how they conceptualized drought risk in their drought EAP, how they use the data, how they combine the data. So she will walk us through this process. And thanks a lot, Naomi, for being here today with us. I think this is a great opportunity to learn from you and from your early action protocol. So with no further ado, I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen, and hi everyone. As Karen has mentioned, my name is Naomi Nyanya, and I work with the Kenya Red Cross, supporting the data team in terms of doing risk analysis and supporting generally the National Society in terms of doing information management, data literacy, supporting programs work. Please allow me to share my screen. Let me know if it is visible from your end.
Yes, it's visible, not in full screen yet, but on the way.
There?
Yes, we're there.
Okay. So I'm here to speak about our work in risk analysis, the development of the drought EAP for the Kenya Red Cross, for Kenya, whereby Kenya Red Cross was the secretariat of the focus-based financing technical working group. Just before I talk about our risk analysis, I just wanted to give a brief background of drought situation in Kenya. And in Kenya, drought is not a rare event because around 80% of our land is made up of semi-arid and arid lands, whereby we receive around 200 to 500 millimeters of rainfall. And in the last decade, these ASAL areas have endured 3 severe drought, whereby one happened between 2010 to 2011, another one between 2016 and 2017, and the most recent one happening between 2020 and 2022, which was the most severe and also the longest drought, with having experienced about 5 failed rainfall seasons. So we had around 4.2 million people affected by this drought, which was a representation of around 20% of the ASAL population. And these people were facing high levels of acute food insecurity. And we also had around 785,000 people in emergency states. So in terms of our drought EAP summary. It's covering mostly the arid and semi-arid lands of Kenya, which are about 23 counties. And our prioritized impacts are water scarcity, reduced crop yield, and also loss of pasture, which are considered as the primary impacts of drought. And from there, it's when we start experiencing other secondary impacts, like maybe outbreak of waterborne diseases and food insecurity. Some of the proposed early actions with regards to each of these prioritized impacts are like for water scarcity, we intend to do assessment of wash needs, preparatory activities for cash for wash, awareness creation and sensitization on wash, rapid assessment on functionality of water facilities, repair and rehabilitation of water facilities, desilting of water pans, repair of earth dams, installation of mass water storage tanks, and also activation of water committees. And then with regards to reduced crop yield, look forward to providing input support in terms of procuring and distributing of drought-tolerant seeds, advocating for crop diversification, and also advocating for improved post-harvest crop management to reduce post-harvest losses. In terms of loss of pasture, we intend to do rangeland management, whereby we want to advocate for expansion and protection of fallback grazing areas, advocacy on pasture management and provision of fodder for priority stocks, and also to procure and distribute pasture seeds. And then we also have these cross-cutting early actions, such as dissemination of early warning information and participatory scenario planning and design of advisories. We are targeting around 150,000 households. I mean, people out of around 934 people who are at risk of drought in Kenya, based on the risk analysis that we did. And our activation budget is around 499 CHF. Mostly we receive our source of forecast information is from the Kenya Meteorological Department with a lead time of around 12 weeks. And just to mention that we've been able to activate our drought EAP. We activated it in June last year. And some of the activities are still ongoing. We activated it in 2 counties in Kenya. And some of the activities are still ongoing. So, what creates drought risk next to rainfall deficit? And in this regards, I'm going to speak about how our National Drought Management Authority defines it, and it considers that the effect of rainfall deficit on the environment using SPI and BCI, but also follows up by doing monitoring of other indicators that shows drought impact on people. And so once the rainfall deficit is felt on the ground, then this is said to be an alert phase of drought. But when that failure when we have failure in environmental indicators leading to fluctuation in production, and it's both production in livestock and also crops, then we say that then this drought is in the alarm phase. And then if that condition worsens, then it goes to the emergency phase of drought. And at this point, normally is whereby the standard precipitation index is below -0.98. So in terms of understanding drought risk, we used the INFORM framework, whereby we say that it is not just enough to understand the hazard, but we also need to put into consideration exposure, vulnerability, and also adaptive capacity. And this is the INFORM framework that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And so just discussing on exposure, what elements are affected when drought event occurs. As most of you have indicated in the Menti exercise, people, livestock, and crops are mostly affected when drought event happens. And for us to just gain insight on the exposed population, because we do not have data on livestock and maybe acreage of crops that are affected, so we mostly focused on population. We analyzed information on VCI and SPI, looking at frequency of extreme drought in Kenya. And for us, we used the National Drought Management Authority categorization of drought, whereby alarm or worsening stage is considered when the SPI is less than negative 0.98 and the VCI is below 30%. So we just wanted to analyze how many times have we experienced this kind of events in Kenya by analyzing the VCI and the SPI. And from the analysis, just looking at these two maps, if we just consider the VCI, then we see that the counties in the northern and also the eastern parts of Kenya are more likely to be affected by extreme drought. While if we consider the SPI frequency alone, whereby SPI is less than negative 0.98, we see that at least each county in Kenya has been affected by extreme drought event. And this is for a time span of from 1992 to 2019 data. So we overlaid the settlement data on exalted frequency analysis for SPI, just for us to be able to understand how many people are exposed to drought, especially in the ASAL areas, because we've seen that in Kenya, most of the drought events happens in the northern and eastern parts of Kenya, which are mostly the ASAL areas. So after overlaying that information, we took like the upper quartile of areas that have been affected. And since we do not have information on either acreage of land that has been, or acreage of land, arable land in that area, or even the number of livestock in these specific areas, then we used the livelihood zones for us to be able to understand then, like for each county, among the number of people who've been exposed or who are exposed to drought, how many of them are, for example, agro-pastoral, how many are doing marginal mixed farming, how many are doing fixed mixed farming or are purely pastoral. And this will later guide in implementing the early actions. So among the counties that were picked and had the highest population of people exposed to drought, we had a total of around 5 million people who are highly exposed to to drought in these 23 ASAL counties. So after that, we wanted to know, okay, what are the factors that make these people susceptible to negative effects of drought? Sorry, this is supposed to be drought. And also what existing system create an enabling environment to also prepare, respond, and adjust to recover from negative effect of drought. So we started by looking at our historical drought events and also impacts that have been reported in Kenya. And since we do not have like one central data repository to get that information from, we developed a drought database by getting information from sources such as our own Emergency Operations Center, getting information from DREF reports for IFRC emergency database, and also Disinventor data. And we also sourced some additional information from other sources like ReliefWeb, UNESCO database, and also University of Nairobi database. We combined all this information and then we cleaned that data to ensure that there was no duplicates. And how we did the cleaning was to check duplicated records by the area that has been reported and also the dates. So if we had multiple records reported, for example, in a village in Nairobi, let's say, not Nairobi, in Marsabit, for example, and we had multiple records from all these databases, then we would just pick one and remove the others. So we analyzed that data and we were using 3 key questions as we do the analysis. We wanted to understand how common are drought events in Kenya, which areas are mostly affected by drought, and also what are the most reported impacts of drought. And after doing the analysis, we saw that there was an increasing trend in terms of the number of people being affected by drought across the years from 1973 to around 2021. And also in terms of drought events that had been reported, majority of them were again on the northern and eastern parts of Kenya, which forms the 23 ASAL counties. And then in terms of reported impacts, we had many, but we just picked the top 10, and these included food shortages or insecurity, reduced or loss of livelihood, crop failure, disease outbreak, impacts on education, whereby, for example, children were unable to go to school because they needed to look after their animals, so there was no food. Water shortages, conflict and insecurity, poor wash standard, and also issues on protection, gender, and labor, whereby, for example, there was increased GBV. We combined all those indicators into that thematic area, and then displacement. And of course, the magnitude of these impacts were varying across different counties in Kenya. So with this, presenting this to the FBF technical working group, then they were able to identify 9 indicators that were to form vulnerability and also adaptive capacity. And how they came up with these indicators, we were also looking, because they can be more, we were also looking at the recency of the data and also reliability of that kind of information. And we also made reference to the global scale drought risk assessment for agricultural system paper, which provided a number of indicators on adaptive capacity and also vulnerability. And it provided a weighting criteria. And this weighting is also what guided our weighting, because doing the weighting with the technical working group, was a bit a challenge with no background in the weighting. It was a bit a challenge because it was informed by, it could have been informed by the expert knowledge, of which some of them could not agree on how to weigh each variable. So this paper supported us in doing the weighting, or in guiding on how to do the weighting, and we agreed, and we came up with weighting normalization formula, whereby for each indicator that we had selected, for example, to be our either coping capacity or vulnerability indicator, we got the weights from that paper. And then we came up with our own weight, whereby we took, for example, if it was improved water sources, then the new weight will be that value 0.76 divided by the sum of all the indicators under coping capacity. And then if it is, for example, something like poverty incidence, it had been weighted as 0.75. So to get the new weight that will have been or will be used in our risk analysis, then we took 0.75, which is the poverty incident weight, divided by the sum of all the indicators under vulnerability. So, and that is what now informed our vulnerability index, whereby it was the poverty incidence and its weight plus all the other indicators. And of course, now coming up with the risk index, we multiplied the vulnerability index, multiplied by the lack of coping capacity index, and the exposure index. And from our risk analysis, you see that, again, most of the counties that are highly at risk of drought, considering all those three components, are counties in the northern part of Kenya, and some in the eastern bit. So yeah, this is now what forms or become the basis of our prioritization on area for implementing the early actions. So yeah, so how does risk analysis fit to trigger and also selection of intervention area? So for us, we still used risk analysis in justification of impact level. Out of all the forecasts that were analyzed, we picked SPI and VCI, which are the operational indicators that are being used by the National Drought Management Authority. And we also picked the thresholds for extreme drought based on the National Drought Management Authority classification. So what we needed to do is to understand, based on this threshold, how many times will we have triggered the EAP in the past. And so what we did was to overlay or to combine data from the SPI, whereby the SPI value was either less than negative 0.98 with 33% probability, and combine that data with our drought or reported drought impact database to see, okay, given this threshold, then how many do we have events whereby we will have triggered this EAP. And we had some records identified in the year 2005, whereby 5 counties were affected by this extreme drought based on the SPI, 2007, 2010, and also 2016, where we had 2010 and 2016 had a majority of the counties affected. And so from that, then we saw that, okay, between that time frame from 2010 to 2016, not 2010, but 2005 to 2016, then we will have triggered our EAP 4 times, which is, it's fairly okay. So the thresholds were okay to be used for our trigger. Maybe you're wondering why at first I spoke about VCI, and as we continue to do the analysis, we are not considering the VCI, but we're just working with SPI. And that is because in our trigger statement, we decided to work with SPI because we could not find VCI hindcast data to do analysis or skill analysis. And this is because VCI forecast model is relatively new, and it was introduced in 2020 to Regional Center for Mapping and Resources and Resources for Development. And also we receive SPI forecast on a monthly basis, but for VCI, it's on a weekly basis, and therefore we needed to do some additional processing for it to be combined. And so maybe this is something that we know that it is an important indicator of drought from even the analysis that we did in the past, but since we could not verify the skill, then that's why we dropped it. But in future, it's something that we will consider to improve our trigger model. So in terms of identification of intervention area, from the risk analysis that we've done, we've developed a risk map that shows areas that are at risk based on exposure, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity. So once the Kenya Meteorological Department issues a forecast whereby the trigger will be exceeded, and our trigger here is SPI being less than negative 0.98, then hazard information, which is now the forecasted SPI, will be added to the risk analysis. And for us to select the intervention areas, because we will have maybe more than 2 areas, maybe more than even 3 counties or 5 counties or more affected or at high risk of drought, for us to select which areas to implement our anticipatory action, then we are only going to consider areas that are in alert or normal state of drought. And that is after, again, considering information from National Drought Management Authority bulletins, which indicates, for example, if an area is in the normal drought phase, a county is in the normal drought phase, if it is an emergency state, or if it is tending to alarm state. So that is additional information that we are going to consider for us now to select intervention area for anticipatory action. And if an area has already exceeded the trigger level and the condition on the ground indicates that it is in alarm or in emergency state, then that is an area for response and not really anticipatory action. So yeah, that's how we did our risk analysis. Some of the challenges that we had as we did the analysis was, as I mentioned, we did not have like a centralized database on disaster impact, and we had to work and look for this kind of information from different sources. And in most cases, the data was not in a good format, like it was not in CSV file, or in most cases, the data was stored in PDF reports. And so you needed to do additional processing for it to be in a good format that could be analyzed. And again, in some area, the data was not, actually in most areas, in most reports that we came across, this information on drought impacts was summarized at a very high level. For example, you could find the information analyzed at regional level. And so getting that information at a ward level that could inform, for example, intervention, it was not there. Only very few reports could provide information at a very granulated level. The other thing was there was no goodwill from some institution to share the data. They have very good data, but they could not share that data with us. For some, we had to do a memorandum of understanding to be able to get data, but some, again, they could not be able to share. And that is one of the challenges that we have, especially with our IBF, updating our IBF portal, because some of the data that needs to fit into that system, it's not in a good format. We do not have like APIs that you can just directly link and get that information updated. The information for the organizations that share the data, the information is in PDF. So 510 and team who are supporting us in developing that system, they will develop a very good script to analyze or to read that data from PDF. But again, you find that the format of those tables keep on changing and then keep on getting errors. So that has been quite a challenge to us. And also with regards to most of the vulnerability indicators, the data that we used was from the census data, which is very comprehensive, but that data is collected after every 10 years. So we need to find a way on how we will get updated data. Of course, some of the variables might not change very much by year, but for some, for example, population might change. So maybe in future we need to consider using more other ways on how to get or to update these vulnerability indicators. So yeah, some of the recommendation that we have then was to just advocate for sharing of humanitarian data, which is not just data on disaster impact and events, but also information on population data and factors that influence vulnerability, and just coming up with an centralized online database on all this humanitarian data that can fit into, or that can get data, can source data from different organizations. The other thing is to build capacity of local communities to communicate disaster impact, because yes, we have like a drought impact database, but we cannot say it's comprehensive because that is based on the reports that we've gotten from the ground. So in areas that maybe they've not shared or they've not reported, then that information will not be captured. Yeah, so the other recommendation is to strengthen local disaster monitoring system at lowest administration level, such that we will not get this kind of information that is at very summarized at high level, but it will trickle down into smaller administrative level like wards and even villages. Yeah, and that's it from my side. I will welcome any question that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I think this was a really great overview and very detailed into how you did certain things. And this is exactly why we do the series, to give others the chance to see how others approached, in this case, the risk analysis, for example. Thanks so much. Yeah, there are some questions in Slido. Before I move into Slido, is there someone who has a very urgent question and want to unmute now before I move into the Slido that is not in the Slido yet? Okay, I don't see anyone, because otherwise we have very well used the Slido as well. So let me start maybe with the database, but there's been lots of interest in the database, Naomi. One, I mean, I think there are several aspects to it. Let me start, how do I start best? So one was how difficult it was to access basically government data and then to do cooperate sustainably with the government actors. And and also maybe staying with this access question, did you have challenges in also accessing data from stakeholders, and how did you overcome that? Maybe those two access questions with the government and then other stakeholders, what was challenging, what worked well? Maybe we start with that.
Yes, it was not easy to get data from government stakeholders. So although some of them were part of our technical working group, so we made use of, for example, if there was a government institution that was not part of our technical working group and you wanted to get data from, we would liaise with the National Drought Operational Center, which is the chairman, not chairman, which is the chair of the technical working group to reach out to write to them to be able to share data with us. But in some areas we had to develop like memorandum of understanding for them to be able to share that kind of information with us. But some of them were still adamant.
And staying with the challenges, how you started and then you overcome them, and then how long did it take you to actually compile this whole drought database, and how did you then set it up? And is that something that you then shared? Because you said that there is the technical working group, you had memorandum of understandings to access data, but was that then also given back to other stakeholders? Is that somewhere centralized? And then there was another question that is slightly linked, and that is the question of insurance. So there was the question if it was possible to also use satellite imagery, because many insurance providers use this publicly available weather data for drought insurance payouts. So if that was one of the stakeholders, perhaps that was also in the technical working group, or how if at all you dealt with this. So two questions: how long did it take you, and is this given back to everybody? Is that a centralized database that people can access? And second, what about the satellite imagery, and how if this idea of insurance was also discussed?
Okay, so with regards to how long it took to develop the database, I can say it was a continuous, because we started doing this process in 2019, but we got really comprehensive database at around 2021, by the end of around 2021. And it was, I can say it was a continuous process to update the database. We started with data from our own Emergency Operational Center, data that has been reported through our EOC. And then we updated that data with draft reports from IFRC, checked if there were any duplicates, and then there is also some good information of drought from emergency database and the disinventor database. So having those three combined, is it 3 or around 4? We combined them, we combined the data, removed the duplicates, and kept on updating and sourcing for information from social media and other reports, just to keep on updating the database. And yes, this data, we are supposed to update it on HDX. That is an action from my side. So yes, we will have this data public to anyone who, or any organization who will want to use it through humanitarian data exchange platform. In terms of using satellite imageries, yes, can say yes and no, because we used settlement data. We used settlement data to overlay it with the SPI analysis to be able to understand which population is exposed to drought mostly, and which one is not. But we also look forward to, maybe in terms of updating this kind of information, working with either, what do you call them, humanitarian OpenStreetMap. We conduct a lot of mapathons to map areas that we've done that for floods, but we've not done that for drought, to map areas that are at risk of drought also.
Thanks a lot, and there's lots of follow-up questions in Slido on the database. So, for example, like, who manages the database now going forward? And linked to that, the question: what is the role of the government also in this? Like, are they supporting in this development of the database? Is there maybe ownership from their side? Yeah, what is their role in keeping basically this database up to date, if they have a role at all?
Well, currently they do not have a role in terms of updating the database. So it is our own initiative to reach out to them to get more updated information that we can use to update it. But our plan is, after we have like a goodwill from most of the institution, and we are trying to push this through the National Council of Population Development. They are working with UNFPA to develop like centralized data repository for population data. So this is something that maybe instead of just doing population data, then we can also include disaster information into it, and loop an organization like National Center for Disaster Operation to be in charge of it. And once we have like a centralized data repository that it's getting data from all these other agencies, the NDOC, that is National Disaster Operational Center, can be in charge of such a system. And we can always support in terms of doing any updates or any other role that they will see fit for us. So
Great.
there are some ongoing initiatives to have such a system. We just need to loop in issues on disaster.
I mean, I think that's a general challenge in most of the, like, in the different contexts where we work, right? I think data sharing is always a challenge, and then how and where do you store this? So, I mean, I think Kenya is one of the cases. Germany is certainly another one. So I think there's lots of cases when we talk about, finding and sharing data and updating it, and where and how. So thanks for your insights. For those of you who have to drop off, we are on the top of the hour, but we have another 30 minutes to discuss. I would just like to briefly inform you about let me just open what's up next. So that is just, here we go. So so what's up next? Now we got it. So in 2 weeks we will be talking about drought forecasting tools. So we will zoom into the trigger development, and we will hear examples from Burundi. So for those of you who need to drop out now, I hope to see you in 2 weeks on the 30th of March. Again, same time. For those of you who like to stay,